Good day. I hope you are having a wonderful weekend, and I'm glad you can take the time to devote to worship. If you go back far enough, London was a small little city. Now it's one of the largest cities in the world, and so you have to go back rather far. So you'd have to go back to the before the 5th century for this to be the case. But if you go far enough back, not only was London a small city, merely an outpost on the northern edges of civilization, but all of England was considered the wild lands. In the year 122 AD, the Roman emperor built a wall across Britain to keep, because everything north is a wall across Britain called Hadrian's Wall, and everything north of it was just like, there be dragons, like the hinterlands. That's where barbarians live up there, and we're never going to go up there because it's crazy, right? We're not going that far. And so northern England was not where you'd go to vacation or anything like that. And so over time, as the church grows, as civilization is developing, begin to develop some monasteries in England. Monasteries being a place where monks, people who have made a commitment to follow Jesus with lifelong vows of service, obedience, chastity, and humility, are living. And one of them in the 4th century, a dude named Pelagius, was born in 354. A guy named Pelagius was born up in these wild lands of England. And so he is born, and Pelagius is a rather intense fellow. And he thinks people need to take following Jesus more seriously. I have a hard time thinking about Pelagius without hearing what he says in the voice of Sam the Eagle from the Muppets, just in case that reference means anything to you. But like this, or just try harder. And that's his gig. He wants people just to try harder, right? If you're struggling with sin, just try harder. And and he just got tired of people saying, you know what, I just can't help it. The temptation got me. I couldn't help myself. I'm just a sinner. And just try harder. We've all faced temptation, but just try harder, and you can gut through it. And he makes this argument that if you just try hard enough, you'll never sin again. So try harder. And he is arguing this point, like this is his argument, try harder, when he takes a trip to Rome. Now, Rome is the center of the world at that point. Rome is the head of the Roman Empire, and it's the capital of the Roman Empire in the 4th century. If the word tetrarchy comes to mind, because you're a student of Roman history, I'm just going to say capital of Rome with an asterisk, and let's just not get into that. But it is the capital of Rome at that point, of the Roman Empire. And so the Roman Empire, one of the largest empires that ever existed, had been built on the backs of some very serious dudes, had been built on the backs of Roman citizen, soldier, farmers. These guys who could take up the sword and the shield, and they would go off and they would fight in the Roman legions, and they would conquer land for the empire, and then they could come back and bring in the harvest, and they could do that all in 1 year because they were serious dudes who had things to do, right? And so the Roman idea of the soul is that it was the driving force that kept you moving. And so if you weren't moving, if you were just sitting on the couch, you had no soul because you weren't moving. And so this sense of like driven people, Pelagius would have loved them. But that's what founded Rome. That was hundreds of years before the point at which Pelagius shows up. When Pelagius shows up at Rome, Rome isn't the same as it once was. Rome is a city where people would get the free bread allotment being brought in from Egypt, and there were a lot of people who they would have the lords they would go and check in with in the morning to play like the local politics, and then they would get their free bread ration, and then they go to the Roman circuses, and that was the life. And so Pelagius, who already has this sense of like try harder, he shows up and it's like culture shock. There's always culture shock when you go from rural America to the city, but like this is far greater because like Pelagius is from the far reaches of the empire, where if you didn't work, you didn't eat, you'd probably die from exposure or starvation, right? And he comes to Rome, and people are just living off the dole, or the word dole hadn't been invented yet and wouldn't be for another millennia. But you get the point, right? The people are living that sort of a pushover lifestyle. And so Pelagius just like doubles down on this try harder approach to following Jesus. Like, if these people here, they're not taking following Jesus seriously. You need to try harder. And if you try harder, you're going to be better at following Jesus. And you try harder, then you're not going to sin. And so as he continues to preach this, people are attracted to it. And then people are gathering around it and saying, yeah, I think this is right. And he pushes the argument further. And he says, well, you know what? If you just tried harder, like, you'd never sin. In fact, if you have a child and you raise the child to try harder, that child will never sin. If everyone is just like me, if everyone just tries hard like I try hard, everyone would just be perfect. And you can see some potential flaws in that argument, if everyone should just be like me, because that's always kind of a dangerous argument to make. But that is what Pelagius is pushing, that sin is not a condition. It is not that all people are born sinners. It's that sin is an action. And we can just try hard enough that we'll never choose that action. And because if we don't try hard enough, then we're all going to burn in hell because we didn't try hard enough, right? So, serious, dude. A little bit too serious, right? So, and he also has this argument that we don't need to baptize infants. Why would we baptize infants? Because baptism is something done for adults who didn't try hard enough to wash away the sin of them not trying hard enough not to sin, so now they can try hard again. So people are gathering around Pelagius, and the leaders of the churches, the bishops, start to realize that they need to get together and have a response. They need to figure out what they think of this. And so they get together. It's called the Council of Carthage. And they get together. It's 418 AD. And on the whole, the church, some people are convinced by Pelagius, but on the whole, the church says Pelagius is wrong. That Pelagius is wrong, that we are born with the brokenness of sin, that we are born as sinners who are going to live into that brokenness. We are going to choose to sin. That the world is broken and we inherit its brokenness is probably the best definition I've heard, the best description I've heard of how people understand, like how do we see infants as newborns as sinners? Well, the world is broken and we are born into and inherit that brokenness, right? And so, in the first casualty of sin is truth. The first casualty of sin is the ability to name and see and understand what is true. And so for Pelagius and these others who say you just got to try harder and then you'll never sin, for them to say that this is the case, just try harder, just be like me, is oddly like just opening the door to sin, because they think, well, if I'm trying hard enough, I'll never sin, so I must be trying hard enough, so I've never sinned. And yeah, that's problematic. If you've ever heard the adage that the first step is to admit you have a problem, like that's true. The first step to grappling with sin is admitting that you have a problem. So, why are we telling this story today? What brings this up? It comes up because I was asked a question about infants and sin and how do we think about that. And so I tell you this story of how we arrive at the idea of sin being something we're born into, and it's not something we just try hard about, that it's something that we inherit and we grapple with. Because it's important to ponder this, and it has some surprising implications for how we live. Are children born innocent, sinless, and perfect, or not? And how does that impact how we view children and how we view each other? Right, so as Pelagius said, all children are born perfectly innocent, and if they just try hard enough, if they're raised to try hard enough, they can be without sin. And that is very appealing to a sort of American mindset of just try harder. If you have a problem in life, if you just try harder, you'll solve it. And if you can't solve it, you haven't tried hard enough. And that if you need to provide for your family and you're not making enough money, just try harder, get another job. And if you can't provide for your family, you're just not trying hard enough. And so it just feels like it lines up with that, right? If you don't want to sin anymore, just try harder. And if you're still sinning, then you're obviously not trying hard enough. Yet, here's the question I would ask. Does anyone ever had a child that they didn't have to teach to share, right? Like, I think it's the reality that children are born with the ability to sin that they're going to. Like we are born with inclinations that are just not healthy. We are born selfish. We are born self-centered. We have to be, and I mean, one understanding of sin is to say that it is the heart turned inward. It is a selfishness. It's putting me first above all else, and that's kind of describes children. They put themselves first above all else, and they have to be taught. They have to be formed to see their neighbor so that they can love their neighbor. It's not something that comes naturally, and I think that is we inherit the part of the brokenness of the world, and I think that's what we see. It's not a matter of just trying hard and children will never have to grapple with sin. I think every child is born with the brokenness of the world. And I think this is what we see described in Scripture. If you go back to the first time that sin is mentioned in the Bible, it is when Cain kills Abel. This is in Genesis 3. The Lord said to Cain, this is after Cain has killed Abel, "Why are you angry? Why has your countenance fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? If you do not do well, sin is lurking at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must master it." Right? So this way that sin is described, the first time it's talked about, is it's described as this, like, I imagine it's like a panther waiting at the door, waiting to pounce, like waiting to get someone. And this idea that sin is a force that has to be reckoned with, and that's how it seems to function. And look across the Old Testament. People fall to sin, even like King David falling to sin when he is tempted and he does the census. That's a different story. But like to say that sin is a force that all have to grapple with, I think that is real. It's not a matter of trying hard to avoid it. It is that temptation to sin is there, and at some point all of us will fall to that temptation. In the New Testament, this understanding of sin as a force that we have to grapple with, it is assumed, as it is discussed, that all have given in. All are sinners. This is not something we can try to avoid. Paul doesn't have any carve-outs or exceptions. When Paul writes the church at Rome, the letter to the Romans is Paul's most worked out, thought through sort of explanation of the faith. And when he writes to the church at Rome, he writes, it's in Romans 3, there is no one who is righteous, not even one. Like no one has always gotten it right. Everyone has sinned at some point, right? All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, is exactly how Paul puts it. He doesn't say here, all have fallen short of the glory of God except those who tried hard enough, right? All have fallen short of the glory of God except for those children who were just born and they have tried hard. No, it doesn't say anything like that. It says all have fallen short of the glory of God. All have sinned. Later in the letter, he says this again, just as sin came into the world through one man and death came through sin, so death spread to all because all have sinned. Not some have sinned, it's those have sinned except those who tried hard enough, right? In Romans 6:23, where the wages of sin is death, right? And following Pelagius' argument that sin is something you can avoid if you just try hard enough. Like if you raise a child the right way, whatever that means. But if you raise a child right to try hard, then that child will never die, except it's not how it works, right? We could go on like this for a while. There are other examples, but I think it's clear where Paul stands. All are sinners. This is not something we can solve by just trying harder. It's not something, and Paul says, there's nothing that can separate us from the love of God, not even sin, but all are sinners. And Paul was a first century Jew, raised to believe it's in the same way that Jesus would have been raised. And Jesus never says contra this. He never says something different to this. And Jesus was quick to correct. He says multiple times, "You have heard it said, but I say unto you, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth." Like the whole Sermon on the Mount, there's a whole chunk of that where he says, "You have heard it said, but I say unto you," and he's correcting and nuancing and changing previous understandings. But he never gets into this because he follows through on the Jewish teaching that he was trained into and that Paul was trained into, that sees sin as a force that all have to grapple with and that gets all of us. And so it became the stance of the church fathers, the people of the first couple centuries who take the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus and interpret it in the light of the letters of Paul, the Gospels, the Old Testament, that this is the understanding that all are sinners, that we are born into this sin, we inherit it, and that is something that we have to grapple with. And so the Bible never explicitly says children are sinners, but it assumes it, because it assumes that all people are sinners. And we see this in the way that when Peter baptizes the centurion's household in Acts, he goes to the centurion's household and he baptizes the entire household. It doesn't say he baptizes the adults. It says he baptizes all the household, which would include children, because all in short, all need to be baptized, all are called to follow Jesus. And that is how we grapple with sin. The way we grapple with sin is not to just try harder. The way we grapple with sin is to follow in the footsteps of Jesus and accept forgiveness. So, how does this impact how we live today? Why does this matter, this little jaunt down history? First, it matters because it reaffirms the importance of how we raise children, of how we form children. To raise children, form children, to teach and train. Children are not born perfect to be preserved in that perfection, right? Children are born sinners who will be selfish, and to raise children is to form them to follow Jesus. And it is one of the most important tasks we have in our entire lives. Not, as I said, not because children are born perfect to be kept perfect, but because children are born self-centered. I was, we all were, and we need to be formed and raised to be Christ-centered and neighbor-centered. And it takes a community to do this. Parents cannot do it alone. And so one of the most important questions we can ask is there anything we can do to love and serve and form the children in our lives? Because we're all connected to children in some way. And how can we help them to be raised and formed and shaped to understand that they are loved and forgiven, and that following Jesus is the way that we grapple with and understand how we handle sin in our lives. So the second way I think that this shapes our understanding of the world around us is that it shapes how we see people and how we see other people, the way other people live their lives. For everyone we look at is someone who was born a sinner. And we can always expect people to try. Like, it's not like Pelagius was completely off base with the idea that we need to try harder. Like, we do need to put effort and exertion into following Jesus. He pushed it way too far, but that base idea, like, we can expect people to try, but that doesn't mean that we can expect that we will be perfect. We can't expect that of ourselves, and we cannot expect that of others. For any one of us to screw up, to sin, to fall short, that's not the exception. That is just a Tuesday. That's just how life works. So we are all born sinners and made in the image of God. We are all, we're never going to get everything right, and we are each entirely capable of reflecting the glory of God in our lives. As Martin Luther puts it, simultaneously saint and sinner. That's how he describes anyone who follows Jesus. Simultaneously a saint and a sinner. And that is true. We see people and we can respect each person no matter what they have done with their lives, good or bad, because each person is always made in the image of God. Each person is always going to be grappling with sin, and each person is capable of following Jesus. Thus, and needs to do so, and can choose to do so, and can make that choice at any time. People can make that choice to follow Jesus even today and find a new path, the path of forgiveness, the path of transformation by the Holy Spirit, the path of heading towards the kingdom where everything will be made right, not because we try harder, but because of the power of the cross and the resurrection as we head towards Jesus and the kingdom to come. Thanks be to God. Amen.